Welcome to Constant Variables, a podcast where we take a non-technical look at building and growing digital products. I'm Tim Bornholt. Let's get nerdy. This episode is brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. We build best-in-class iOS, Android, and web apps. We do this by integrating with teams that lack mobile expertise and work together to deliver creative mobile solutions that actually solve real business problems. To learn more about us and see our pricing, something we're quite transparent about, visit us at jmg.mn. One small request before we get into this week's episode. We're trying something new with ratings and reviews for our show. We know these asks are a little annoying, but they're very valuable to us. And as a thank you for taking the time to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, we will give you and or your company a shout out on the show. Leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, get free advertising. It's that simple. Even simpler, we've put a link in the show notes to take you right there. Or just head to constantvariables.co/review. Today we are chatting with Michael Zuercher, CEO and co-founder at Prismatic. We have a wide-ranging conversation about how organizations can use embedded iPaaS systems to get their data to talk to each other, how he started a company while in college and grew it to be one of the biggest purveyors of technology for small-town public safety organizations, and what it's like to buy and sell entire companies. So, without further ado, here is my interview with Michael Zuercher. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you aboard here today. Why don't you tell my audience here a little bit about yourself and about your company, Prismatic?
Sure. So I'm a co-founder and CEO at Prismatic. Prismatic is a embedded integration platform as a service, which we'll probably talk a bit more about coming up here. But I'm a second-time founder of a software business. Ran my last startup for about 15 years, and after exiting that, started my current company, Prismatic. And I'm excited to talk more about it.
Right on. I hear a lot about the term iPaaS and, integrated platform as a service. And it seems like everything is an as a service these days, if you're in this technical space. But I'd love for you to maybe help define that term for somebody who maybe has never heard of it before.
Yeah. So, integration platform as a service, as you said, is kind of the new buzzword of sorts in the integration world. But in a lot of ways, it's not terribly dissimilar from what's been happening for, literal decades around integrations. For a long time, businesses have been using multiple systems to do what they need to do. Maybe they have a CRM and an ERP and a finance system, for example. And those things all need to exchange data. So integration platforms originated a long, long time ago to help businesses make the connections between systems that are needed for efficiency and things. Now, that started with big businesses. It started at kind of the top end of the market where there was more efficiency to be found. And those platforms were very expensive originally. Then, what's happened probably kind of throughout all of technology is the expectations that larger businesses have had come down market to where mid-sized companies are expecting and need a lot of internal integrations. And at this point, small businesses expect a lot of integration with tools like Zapier, for example. And so, that's kind of the traditional path of integrations and integration platforms. And what happened is, as the cloud became more prevalent and as the right answer to enable integrations became to put the platform in the cloud, we suddenly started calling it integration platform as a service. And so, in a lot of ways, it's just a really natural evolution of the platforms that exchange data between systems inside a business. Now, where Prismatic goes a step farther is, rather than just be an iPaaS that's used by a business to exchange things in their internal systems, we are an embedded iPaaS, which means that we are meant for B2B software companies that need to enable interaction between their own product and their customers' systems in their customers' environment, which is really kind of the new piece of the integration market from my perspective, is that you have vendors like us kind of enabling B2B software companies to provide these integrations to their customers in a really simple way.
What's the advantage for a company that is into software to use a service like that as opposed to building out, the integrations themselves?
Yeah. So, as a B2B software company, integrations are a big challenge in a lot of ways. And, it kind of originates in my opinion, from the fact that by their very nature, integrations touch a lot of parts of your company. You have to deal with integrations on the sales side because every customer you're dealing with has different needs. You have to deal with them on the implementation side because often your customer can't go live with your product until the integrations that they need are in place. And then, of course, you have to actually somehow produce them on the R&D side or the product and engineering side. And so you kind of have a lot of different pieces of this, not to mention that you're probably going to have these integrations live for the entire life of your customer, which is, 10 years or 20 years in a lot of business applications. And so you just kind of have this building complexity, I guess, as your customer base grows. And so you run into challenges like, of course, you could build this yourself. You're a software company after all. Of course, you could just write it in code like everything else. But the problem is you end up building a lot of things that have nothing to do with the core domain you're in. So if you're a company that's in the ag space, the agriculture space, selling software to ag vendors, you maybe are going to spend 80% of the time that you're spending on an integration doing things that have nothing to do whatsoever with that domain. Instead, they have to do with reliability and logging and infrastructure and authentication refresh. And, a whole bunch of just kind of boilerplate type things that are really best handled by a platform like Prismatic. And so that's where Prismatic comes in, is we said, how can we provide a platform that provides as much of that kind of low level stuff as possible that is domain in specific, such that a person in the ag space or the ERP space or whatever can instead focus all of their energy on the things that are actually unique to their core offering and build differentiators instead of rebuilding infrastructure over and over and over.
I like the history you gave earlier about how it kind of this whole concept of integration started from huge companies working down now that even small companies now have to worry about things like this and deal with things like this. Would you say is like a perfect time for let's say you're a small company or a startup and you're starting to kind of run into these sorts of concerns. What would you say is like an appropriate time for someone to be considering something like Prismatic?
So, what's happened is that as that has come down market, as the expectation for integrations has come into the small and medium business space, those companies, those customers of a software company, so to speak, don't tend to have the internal resources to build those integrations. Maybe they can build some of them with Zapier or something like that, but unlike a big organization, they don't have a giant in-house group whose job is to integrate internal systems. And so what's happened by its very nature is those customers in the SMB space have put that responsibility, I think rightfully so, onto the vendors that they're purchasing solutions from. And so, what's happened is, and we've all experienced this, if you go buy a piece of financial software to manage your small business, you're not going to imagine that you need to buy that, and then you need to go connect that to your email system and your payment processor and everything else. You're going to expect that automatically connects to those things. And so what's happened is if you're the software vendor selling the financial package, well, basically from day one, if you don't have the integrations to all of those things, you're not a viable option for your customer. And so what we've seen is, our customer base kind of ends up getting split into two segments. The first is earlier stage companies that have to provide all these integrations basically from day one, or their product just doesn't work. And then secondly, an organization that's gotten large enough that they have some additional scale problems, or they've run into the challenges that come with many years of maintaining these things. So my recommendation would be, as soon as you are in a software space selling software where integrations are important, look at platforms like an embedded iPaaS to avoid building the tech debt that you will later have to service. And then, of course, if you're a later stage company that is kind of trying to figure out how to move faster with integrations or be more efficient, that's obviously a good time as well.
What got you into seeing this problem as a business problem that made you want to jump out and start tackling this?
Yeah, so I mean, there is no motivator like personal pain, and I spent about 15 years, like I said, in a previous startup. We sold software to law enforcement organizations and dispatch centers, and that's an interesting space in that we ended up, by the time I exited that business, we had about 2,000 customers, I believe, and something like 600 integrations spread across those customers. And so the average customer used 8 integrations, even though we had many hundreds of them. And this made for just an extremely painful environment as a software company. We were spending close to half of our R&D effort on building and maintaining integrations, which is not what anybody trying to build innovative product wants to hear. We were spending significant amounts of support resources. And it's, in some instances, we weren't able to move as fast as we wanted with customers who needed some new integration because we flat didn't have the capacity. And so we looked years and years ago at my old company, we looked for a solution like Prismatic. And there wasn't anything on the market. Now, of course, you kind of had all the original integration platforms and iPaaSes. But as I kind of explained at the beginning, they only solve, call it half of the problem that we as a B2B, or in that case, B2G software company had. And so this was just stuck in my brain. It was, I have the scars. We spent years and years trying to improve it. We built all kinds of internal tools and we did improve it in some ways. But I would have killed for a solution like Prismatic 8 years ago or 5 years ago. And that's what stuck with me and my co-founders. And when we exited the other business, we were ready to do this.
Yeah, it always, you're right in that being a developer, there is, you see like you spend so much of your time doing these integrations. And when you start to get, a customer, when you start to build up your customer base and each one of them needs different integrations and you're building 600 unique integrations, the maintenance and everything on that and just the mental complexity required to like keep all of that in your head as a developer is just unbearable. So I can totally see why having that concern kind of get punted out to somebody else would free your time up to do, actual innovation instead of spending time, repaving roads all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, our perspective at Prismatic is there's real integration, there's real innovation to be done with your integrations. It's just not, you're not going to innovate on how to store logs. You're not going to innovate on how to store credentials and refresh them. What you're going to innovate on is, hey, how could I pull the agriculture ERP space closer into my product? How could I understand my customer so well that I can show them a workflow that they would have never envisioned by producing an integration? And so, what we want Prismatic's customers who are software companies, we want them focused on how can I use integrations to make lasting differentiators and truly, serve my customers well. Let's get rid of all the cruft and just put that onto a platform.
There's really never an easy time to launch a company, but I would argue, in the years that I've been running my own business, a global pandemic is certainly up there among the most challenging times. What impact did this pandemic have on growing Prismatic?
I think to be honest, I think we got off really easy. We started Prismatic a bit before the pandemic. And so we had a team kind of spun up and we had kind of spent some of the early time building product and envisioning product. And so by the time we all went work from home there for a while, we were already a pretty gelled group with a pretty firm strategy. Of course, in any startup, that's going to be a little bit fluid as you learn more from the market. But we were at that point pretty well geared to just go execute. I think we also got off a little bit easy in that, we've been able to build a team that has at least some folks that have worked together before and have found some really, really great people to add to that team. And so that team gelled very quickly, which is one of the things that I think would be really hard to do or could be really hard to do during a pandemic. And in that way, I honestly think we got to kind of dodge some of the worst of the downsides of the pandemic from a startup perspective. From the other side of it that you think about, not just the internal side, but the external, how is this going to affect the market? How is it going to affect my customers? Those types of things. As we all know, it's not like tech just paused during the pandemic. And so, it certainly has made remote demos more acceptable. I don't travel to larger customers to do demos anymore. And that's probably a really good efficiency win. It's also made it just completely expected that you can reach 6 prospects or 6 customers in one day, which kind of a few years ago would have been much, much harder to do. So I'm sure, I could pick it apart and find some downsides specifically to, to the startup of Prismatic from from the pandemic perspective. But I think we got off easy compared to a lot of organizations.
I think the more that I reflect on the pandemic and kind of listening to what you were saying, it seems like a lot, it seems like a lot of times you have to have the perspective as an entrepreneur to be optimistic and find ways to be adaptable in challenging times. And certainly it's an easy privileged position for me to say, because I didn't get sick and I was able to work from home. And, there's a lot of factors that go into it where I know that this is like a weighty statement, but from like a purely business and entrepreneurial standpoint, I would say like this, usually the trying times and the recessions and the challenging times are the times where as an entrepreneur, you can really dig your heels in, find opportunity, lean into those opportunities and make the most of, what is otherwise a pretty negative situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think trying times call for innovation, and I think startups are generally the innovative ones. And so I think, it certainly isn't a time to be extra fearful as a startup. I think it's a time to say, look, there are new problems to be solved, and we may be really, really well positioned to solve those problems. And I think that's the way we look at a lot of things. But I think, as you kind of said, in hindsight, of course, I'm speaking from a very narrow perspective here, but strictly from the perspective of starting a new software business, I don't think the pandemic really set us back.
Yeah, I think that's how a lot of tech companies have approached it, and you're right. I mean, it's been terrible for other. If you're trying to start a restaurant in March of 2020, God help you, unless you were a delivery service or something. It did not go well for many people. But from a tech standpoint, I think the pandemic has been just like nothing but a net positive, because you've been able to show your technology and show how you're able to help people stay connected when we otherwise couldn't.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So you've obviously, we talked about the other tech startup that you founded before Prismatic a bit. I'd love to lean into that a little more and maybe start with what led you to starting a company during college.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the one word answer to that is naivete. It's just one of those stories that like isn't a complicated story, but in hindsight, it's kind of amazing it worked out at all. I met a sheriff's deputy kind of through happenstance while I was back in my hometown between my freshman and sophomore year of college. And, I was studying electrical engineering and was always kind of an open source software guy a little bit. And, got to talking with him about the software they used. And it turns out they basically didn't have software at this tiny little sheriff's office in the middle of South Dakota. And so, just through, some combination of not having any idea what the world was really made of, and also having a lot of time on my hands, I kind of turned that into what if I worked and built you a product in the way I thought of it as kind of as a summer job. So like next summer, I will, instead of go get a traditional summer internship or whatever, I will start this little company and I'll build what was called a records management system for this law enforcement organization. It'll be a summer thing. You'll have something. Everybody goes home happy. Little did I know I'd spend the next 15 or 16 years doing that. And so, I think in hindsight, I never would have started that if I had any idea what that industry was actually like from a marketplace perspective, if I understood how far-reaching it was going to be from a software perspective, or if I understood how hard that climb was going to be. But I'm certainly glad I did.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. What are some of the challenges that you weren't anticipating when you were that naive college student that jumped in head first?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of on multiple levels. The first is probably the really classic. Everything in software and probably everything in almost anything takes 3 times as long as you think it's going to. So, what I was going to build in a summer ended up taking 2 years or something like that. And, it's just one of those, you don't know what you don't know until you get in there. But I think from a slightly broader perspective, if you look at the public safety market at that time, or the landscape of public safety software, there were a couple of really not great things from a startup perspective. Number one, there were about 200 competitors nationwide. And there are still many competitors in that space. There are less than there were, but it's still a very fragmented market. So you're competing with kind of everybody, big people, little people, all over the board. Second, that market is very geographically specific. So you may have a solution that works well in South Dakota, but as soon as you go to Nebraska or Virginia or California, only pieces of it still make sense because there are legitimate differences in the way law enforcement works in different parts of our country because of state law and all kinds of things. And so, A, you've got a really fragmented market. B, once you build a solution, you're only going to be able to serve some small part of that market from a geographic perspective. And then the third thing is it's a very broad solution. And so in order to serve a police department or a sheriff's office or a 911 center well, you can't just build one piece, as it turns out. As I said, I kind of set out to build the records management side because that's the part that I heard about from this deputy. But as it turns out, nobody can really use your records management system, or at least not very many customers can, unless you also have a jail management system and a dispatch system and a mobile solution for in police cars. And the list just goes on. And before long, you've built out this just really broad, far-reaching business system. And you kind of have to build all of it before you can use any of it somewhere. And so, for customer number 1, we had one of those pieces. For customer number 2, we had to build the second. For customer number 3, we had to build the third and fourth. And by the time we had 5 customers, we had been building product for, I believe, 6 years, which is not the way you want to start, an early stage startup.
Yeah, no, not at all. Usually you want to get something that you can build once and sell to 6 people as opposed to building, 5 or 6 different things and having to incorporate them. But I would have imagine along the way, there were a lot of the things that affected customers 3, 4, and 5 kind of piggybacked on to customer 1, and you were able to just kind of further take all of that knowledge and expand it from there.
Yeah. And, like so many things, some of what I described ended up being a blessing in hiding in hindsight, in that because it was a very geographic, disparate market, we started in South Dakota. That's where I grew up. That's where I live. So we started in South Dakota. Well, South Dakota doesn't have very many people, as a lot of us know. And South Dakota, therefore, doesn't have a lot of law enforcement officers. And so we were going to flat run out of market in South Dakota. And so we very quickly expanded into other states. We moved into Minnesota as a second state and Louisiana as a third state. And the thing that made that a blessing was that, unlike so many of our competitors that got very mature in 1 or 2 states and then decided to become a nationwide company, we were forced to do it almost immediately. And we ended up, one of the things that really made us successful in the long term is that we ended up with a solution that was very configurable and was built with the understanding that we were going to serve a lot of different states. And that then later allowed us to grow very quickly once we put some real resources into, sales and marketing and starting to grow nationwide.
So one thing that you had mentioned was that, you had to learn from customer after customer after customer. And by the time you got to 6 years down the road, you've been building product for 6 years. And that was when maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but felt like you had a more complete system you could take to the market.
Yeah, that's right.
One question I have excellent, good. Do you think that if you would have started again with that 6 years in hindsight, that it would have still taken you 6 years to get to that point? I guess what I'm trying to get at is the whole you don't know what you don't know kind of thing makes sense when you start out right away. But then after you've gotten down the road a ways, did you ever have the urge or did you ever see a need to just scrap it and be like, we're going to rebuild foundationally and we know kind of what it needs to look like? Or was it really just kind of you were just building on top of everything and trying to sort it out and straighten it out as you go along?
Yeah, I think anybody who's ever been involved in a software company always wants to scrap it and start over. I think you always see, hindsight is always 20/20. You always know after the fact how you wish you had built it, and that that was certainly true of us. I think one of our big differentiators in that market is that we were built on a modern platform. And, all of those, as an example, all of those different pieces that I talked about were part of one system, whereas kind of historically in that industry, they were each completely different systems that, ironically enough, were integrated together. And so, I think, of course, there were things that made us want to scrap it and say, hey, I bet if we just made a really concerted effort, we could rewrite this thing in 3 years, knowing what we know now, or something like that. But I think certainly in our case, and I think in the case of most companies, that's the best way in the world to kill yourself. That's the best way to stop being a company is to just pause for a bunch of time and imagine that you're going to, come out with this utopian solution in the end. And, I often reference, at least back then, I often referenced the grand decision by Netscape to step back and rewrite their browser from scratch. And when they came back, IE had, the majority of the market, and that was that. So, I don't think that's probably ever the right answer. We were able, fortunately, to rewrite some of the architectural things as we scaled. But, the reality is some of the code that's still there is original stuff, I think. And, and that's just the nature of software.
I think there's like a famous blog post too about that Netscape example that I always think about whenever I get tempted to go back and you see an app that you wrote 7 or 8 years ago and you're like, oh man, this is still being used. We could have done it with this. We could re-architect it to be more efficient or whatever the cause is. But I'll draw up that post and put it in the show notes because I think it's the guy Joel
Spolsky probably wrote about. Yeah, that seems like something he would write about. I agree.
That article, I always think about that. And I think if you're listening to this and you are running a tech company and you're in that kind of like, you've been going for a few years and you get the urge to scrap it, read that blog post because it shines a lot of light on instead of burning something to the ground and starting from scratch, you lose so much institutional knowledge that you think you might have built up in your head, but likely you don't, and you just have to keep relearning a lot of those mistakes, and things are changing so fast anyway that sometimes it's more efficient to learn how to change the tires on the car while it's driving down the freeway.
Yeah, and we all hear stories all the time of, we're rewriting our X in Y new framework, right? And sometimes that's the right answer if you have some time horizon that you're optimizing for, and the fastest way to get where you need to get on that time horizon is to do this rewrite as part of it. But some, replatforming or rewriting or whatever for its own sake, in my experience, is almost never the right answer.
Yeah. But we've talked a lot now about the early stages, and that was Zuercher Technologies, right?
That's correct.
The company
that's
was.
Right.
Yeah. So you were at Zuercher Technologies for 15 years. How did the early stage, being like a solo founder, compare to the later stage when you've got infrastructure and employees and customers and the whole 9 yards?
Yeah. So I mean, there's almost nothing similar about them. And I actually wasn't a solo founder. I had a co-founder who was a buddy from college who was,
nice.
A very, very technical guy. I'm maybe half technical and he was very technical. So he managed a lot of the kind of back end decisions and architectural things and grew with that company for a long time as well. So I can't really speak to being a solo founder. I think that would be extremely difficult. But even as a 2-person company and then 3 and then 5, at some point, you're wearing. There are a lot of things that are different. One, you're wearing a lot of hats. You're kind of doing everything that somebody else doesn't happen to have on their plate, and that's not just true of the founder. That's true of kind of every employee in an early stage company. And in some ways, that's great. It's for some types of people, that's really energizing and it's really interesting. In some ways, it's awful because your interest is, or your energy is split across so many things that it's hard to do anything really well. So I think that's one of the big differences, between early and later stage. I think another piece of it is that the things that are hard are just completely different sets of problems. So in an early stage company, it is not hard to communicate in your organization. There are 3 of you or 2 of you or whatever, and you sit around a table for lunch and suddenly you've communicated the company's news, right? But that gets really hard when you have hundreds or I can't imagine, but thousands or tens of thousands of employees. I think on the flip side, some things like having visibility into the market are really hard in an early stage company because you just don't have penetration into the market. You don't have salespeople all over the country, whatever. You don't tend to have as much visibility. In a later stage company, through lots of means, you tend to have much better visibility. And so, those are just 2 examples, but I think you're flat solving completely different problems at different stages. And in that way, I would argue the job of CEO or founder CEO is just 2 completely different jobs, or probably actually multiple completely different jobs as a company grows.
How does being like a founder CEO evolve? Like as you get further down the road, do you see yourself spending more time putting out like the more operational problems as opposed, or is it really like the whole trying to delegate and figure out how you can get the right people to help you take on those responsibilities that you used to be doing by yourself as a smaller company?
Yeah, I think different founder CEOs succeed in different ways. But from my experience, in the very early days, you're the chief spokesman of the product. You're probably the product manager, essentially, that's setting strategy and direction from a product perspective. You're probably the main communication with your early customers. And so you're right at the tip of the spear from a customer perspective, from a market perspective, from a product perspective. And that's how you're spending a ton of your time. Then as you grow a little bit, you got to focus on other things. And so, as you said, you have to bring folks in that you can trust, and you have to start to delegate some of those responsibilities. And that's really hard. Figuring out, where your highest and best use is, what you should keep doing, as opposed to what should somebody else be doing, or what is somebody flat better at than I am, is I think a journey that you go on, over the years of growing a company. I think then the other side of it is, as you get kind of to, what I would call mid-sized or something, a few hundred employees, or maybe 100, I think you get to a point where you've now delegated most of the day-to-day to other people. And what you're focused on is almost a second order thing of, setting strategy, making sure the right people are in the right places, and then just making sure that everybody's aligned, making sure that everybody's communicating well. You're starting to deal with really internal company focused type things to some extent, as opposed to as many, exactly what detail of the product should be which way.
One thing you had talked about there was trust and establishing trust as the company grows. What are some techniques or tips that you've seen work effectively to build trust in people that you bring on to take on some of those roles?
Yeah, so I think, the number one thing is hire people better than you at what they're doing. There's no better way to trust somebody than to just accept that they're just legitimately better at this than I am. And, certainly there are probably some things that I'm better at than they are, and I can probably help them with some of that. But who am I to get in their way when they're the one that's really, really good at this? And I've been fortunate to work with a ton of those people at both Prismatic and at Zuercher. I think there's nothing more comforting than watching somebody do what they do so well that you just want to get out of their way, because all you're going to do is do it worse.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if you hire someone better than you, then that almost it implicitly requires you to trust them, because otherwise you are going to be holding them back and stepping over their toes. And nobody wants a micromanager anyway when you're at that kind of a level, or ever for that matter. So that's a really good point on how to build trust. Yeah,
and I think it's one of those things that's easier said than done. First of all, in an early stage company, one of the big jobs of the founder CEO is recruiting, and recruiting is hard. Especially right now in tech, where you have lots of very large tech firms that have remote workers and are paying very well and are very stable. So one of the things you have to do is you have to find those people that are better than you, and then somehow convince them that they should come be on the team. And I think that is not an easy thing. That's not like you post to a job board and the next morning you have somebody. So I think that's part of it, and then I think the other part is, just making sure that as they come on board, they know the way you feel about, them in their role. They know both what you expect of them from I expect you to do this really well because that's what you're here for, but also from a perspective of like, we need to hear your perspective on this. We need to see you do your thing because we flat respect your knowledge on it and want to see the right way.
Yeah, that's one thing I've really tried to do with my own company is giving workers the autonomy to do their job and do it, without us putting there's certain things you have to, put constraints on of maybe how things get checked into a repository or, whatever. Like there's some foundational things that you want to make sure you're consistent on. But for a lot of things, it's like, yeah, the reason that I hired you is because you're smarter than me. And I feel like I know what I'm doing, but I don't know what I don't know. It's nice to bring in people that do know what you don't know and can just jump in and feel the freedom to actually make meaningful change within the organization, as opposed to just kind of being a cog in the wheel.
Yeah, and I think then that starts to speak to, overall company culture and, things that if you don't have culture as an undercurrent, what you described is, in my opinion, almost impossible to pull off. You kind of have to have the base built over a long period of time to encourage all of those things, from the team.
Yeah, I agree. So eventually, you did end up selling Zuercher Technologies to a portfolio company. I think a lot of times people assume that when that sort of a thing happens, when you sell the company, that the founders just basically dust their hands off and walk away with a briefcase full of money or something like that. I assume that wasn't specifically the case for you. I think you stayed on board for a little while. I'm curious to hear, why you chose to stay on board and what eventually led you to leaving that company.
Yeah, with the way all of that happened, I feel like the most fortunate founder in the world. I like to say I essentially got to sell my company twice. And so, what I did is in 2014, 2015, we were to the point that we had a product that was starting to really grow like crazy nationwide. And we were in a lot of ways the first company in that market in more than a decade that had been able to grow that way geographically. And so suddenly we were to a point, we'd always been bootstrapped. We'd never taken any significant outside money, never had any institutional money. We were flat limited by cash flow. And so, it was we needed to do either one of two things. We either needed to decide that we were just going to grow at the rate we could grow, continuing to bootstrap and continuing to, operate with our cash flow. And at this point, we were almost 100 employees. Or we needed to somehow get external capital to essentially put into sales and marketing and all the things that come along behind, to grow nationally quickly. I believe there was an opportunity in the market. I believed we had the right product. Remember, by this point, we're 10 or 12 years in to this journey. And so kind of it's another one of those things where, you take a call that you didn't think was going to mean anything. And then in hindsight, it mattered. I got a call from a person at a private equity firm who was looking at our industry, at the public safety software industry, and had come to a conclusion that I completely agreed with, which was there are a handful of companies that serve the biggest cities in the United States. And that was already basically a consolidated market. But then there were a couple hundred companies that served mid to small agencies in the United States. Think like a few 100,000 population and smaller, all the way down to, your town of 1,000 people. And that was a very unconsolidated market. And so what this private equity group was looking to do was go buy one of the companies that serves big cities and then go buy somebody that serves small cities, put them together and, do all the operational efficiency stuff and the market consolidation stuff with the company serving the big cities, and then just put resources into growing a company that can run through this fragmented market and gain a lot of market share by just having a better product for small cities. And so, that is exactly the way I saw the industry. I had no interest in Zuercher serving big cities. It was just part of the market we just weren't well set up for in a lot of ways. But I really thought there was a ton of progress that could be made with the right capital in the small cities. And so, this took 9 months or something to get put together. But that private equity group eventually went and bought a company called TriTech, which was the best, largest vendor serving, big cities. And then they came to us and they said, like, look, here, you clearly have a product that's getting a lot of market share. You clearly, I assume they understood that we were undercapitalized. And they essentially said, come be part of what we're doing. You can continue to run Zuercher. We'll leave it in Sioux Falls. They even left the brand the same, which wasn't super important to me, but I think is indicative of just how separate we left that organization. And what we're going to do is we're going to finance and we're going to help with the growing of Zuercher into a, truly the largest of the vendors in the, in kind of the small city space. And that was just a super attractive way to me to say, look, we've built for 12 years a product that is now ready to really take off. And it's not like it was nothing at that point, but there was a lot more we could do. It was a really great way to get the capital to do it. And honestly, to get into a situation where I got to learn things that I never A, probably knew I didn't know, and B, never thought I would be exposed to and be able to learn. We did a lot of M&A work. I got to work closely with the board at this private equity firm, and they eventually brought in a CEO for the overall group, who is one of the best guys I've ever worked around, and I got to just learn an insane amount from him very quickly. So I stayed on for about 2.5 years. We grew that, and then kind of as per plan, we sold the overall business, including Zuercher and Tritech, to another private equity firm, and that's when I exited.
Yeah, that really does sound like a fairy tale for a founder. Like that, you hear so many horror stories of being acquired and having just culture issues and finding ways to have organizations kind of blend together and do it in a right way. And this sounds like just such a success story of being able to do it the right way and feel like you've got kind of partners that are helping you, as opposed to, like you always think of like greedy capitalists or someone who's just in it for the money and trying to get in and get out. It's like, it seems like it was actually well executed to pull this vision off.
Yeah, and I think, I'll say it again. I just flat was very fortunate. Our company was very fortunate in the way all of that worked, and some of it just worked out that way. But at the same time, I think the thing that I thought I understood going in, and as it turns out, it was correct, was that our interests were aligned. What I wanted for Zuercher at that point was I wanted us to grow into the most impactful thing we could be in the public safety software market in North America. I was not interested in it being a bespoke company. That has pros and cons, but that's just not what I wanted Zuercher to be at that point. And I think it's not what most of our team wanted it to be. I also didn't want it to be, a small business forever. And that ship had kind of sailed probably as we got close to 100 employees. But I didn't want it to be, a just kind of slowly growing, really stable thing. I wanted to make the biggest impact in public safety we could. And that interest aligned very well with private equity. I mean, obviously they had a financial interest, as did I, in growing that business. And so interest aligned. I wanted us to grow rapidly, and we needed capital to do it. They wanted somebody who was going to grow rapidly and make their return, the way it needs to be. And I think just at the most basic level, that alignment of interest made it in some ways pretty easy for things to go well. At the same time, had I gone into it saying, hey, I want to take some cash off the table, so I want to bring in a private equity partner, but I want Zuercher to continue to be this, this slow growing, really nice place, to work for the next 40 years or whatever, those interests probably wouldn't have been aligned. And so I think alignment is the big thing that made that work.
Are there any lessons or any, we had talked about before with, like things that you had learned in that first 6 years and how you kind of, it took you that long to like build out the product and you learned a whole bunch along the way. Are there any things like having gone through the M&A process that, if you were to, with Prismatic go down this path again of getting acquired, hopefully, and moving on, like, are there any lessons or things that you took away that you would, you might want to share with anyone who's kind of going through a similar situation?
Sure. So, I mean, I was pretty fortunate to be able to be involved in M&A on kind of both sides. So, obviously I sold Zuercher to the portfolio company and the private equity folks, and then was very involved in the process that then sold that overall company to more private equity about 2 or 3 years later. So I was involved in two sell side, processes, but then we also did a lot of M&A ourselves. And I think we probably looked at 15 or 20 businesses to acquire. And I think we ended up acquiring 5 of them over the course of about 3 years. And so there you're on the buy side. And I think having been on both sides gives you an interesting perspective on what makes those deals work or not work. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but it really, in my opinion, all boils down to interest being aligned. You have to assume, I believe, that the other party in an acquisition, whether it's a founder selling or institutional capital buying or whatever, I think you have to assume that everybody is going to act rationally based on the things they're optimizing for, but you better understand what they're optimizing for, or it's going to feel like they're acting irrationally. And so often you hear founders, tell horror stories of, and sometimes they just are legitimate horror stories, but you often hear people tell stories of, we let in this investor, or we sold a big chunk of our company, or we became part of a portfolio company, and then they changed everything. We used to have these really close relationships with customers, and they cut support, or they grew sales and outgrew our ability to deliver. Or we've all heard those stories. And I think all that comes back to, usually people are going to rationally act in the thing that toward what they're trying to do. And often, if you really went back to the beginning of a lot of those stories, you have somebody that came in with a different set of interests than the founder had, or than the selling party had. And so I think you just have to know what everybody wants and assume that they're going to act really aggressively to get whatever they want. And if you're a founder who's looking to exit, maybe those interests do align. Maybe the right thing is like, look, I just need to take cash off the table and get out of here to either retire or just to move on. And they want to fold it into some larger organization, and maybe that's what's best for the company. But at the same time, don't sell to that kind of an organization if what you want to do is stick around and have a 20-year career doing exactly what you're doing. I think you just have to understand what everybody wants.
Being a founder and running your own company, you go through a lot of times, like when you're acquiring customers, it feels like it's the same thing. Like you kind of develop this gut feeling of whether this is going to be the right customer for you, or whether it feels like the incentives are aligned. And it takes a few times of, I'd say in a low stakes environment where you take on a client and you realize, it might be months or years down the road, but eventually you realize like, oh man, I had that feeling at the beginning of this relationship and I thought things were going to get better and they just didn't. I think it feels like, I haven't been through an M&A event myself, but I feel like you kind of learn as a founder and an entrepreneur to kind of harness that biome on your gut to tell you whether or not it's going to be a good situation or not. And with M&A specifically, I would imagine when you're talking with people, if you are shopping your company around and you're talking with different people, that you kind of have to use that same instinct of, are our incentives aligned? Like, does it feel like it's going to be the right relationship? Or if not, then that's fine. There's other opportunities. You can find other options. But I think a lot of times you just feel like, oh, I got to take the first thing that's on the table, or this is going to be the only time I ever get here. So I'm going to, just do it. And even if it feels wrong, I just kind of, is that kind of accurate to what your experiences were?
Yeah, I think certainly there's a personal side of all of this. And, in my specific situation, when we first sold to TriTech into the private equity folks, I pretty quickly realized these were people that knew what they wanted to do, that were really smart about what they were trying to do, and that were being really transparent with me about what they wanted to do, knowing that it might not be what I wanted to do. And it turns out it was, which is what made it work out. But I was super comforted by, some of the really early calls I had with this guy from New York in a private equity firm, where he was just really blunt about what he was looking to do. He wanted to find somebody that was ready to really grow, where the product could keep up, put capital behind it, and grow it like crazy. And that was super exciting to me. But to many of the companies like Zuercher that he probably had talked to, or that I know he had talked to, that was the last thing they wanted to do, because, they just had a different mindset about what success looked like for their business. And that's fine. And I think I was super comforted by how blunt he was about those things before he felt around to really know what I wanted. Because to me, it gave me the impression that, like, I mean, this guy isn't trying to get into a relationship with somebody that doesn't want what he wants. He knows he's stuck with it for years as well. And he was just very blunt. And, I think part of the way that I learned to kind of understand some of that was, those guys never told me, and I never really saw them tell anybody what that person wanted to hear, exclusively, partially because they didn't have the time. Like, they were busy. They knew what they wanted to do. They had a lot going on. And they didn't have the time to make up stories. They didn't have the time to dance around things. They were going to get to the point, and if it wasn't something that worked out, it didn't work out, and you move on. And I think I came to a little bit different understanding about, how founders can think about institutional capital, especially later stage institutional capital, by just understanding their motivation and their world and how busy they are, and knowing that, like, they don't want to be in a bad relationship either. Like, this needs to work for them as well. And if you could just be blunt both directions, it's amazing how fast you can flesh out whether something makes sense.
It's amazing us Midwesterners just don't have that bone in our bodies usually, to be blunt. So it's nice working with someone from the East Coast who can just throw it down first, which kind of gives you the freedom to feel like you can be blunt right back.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's certainly a regional thing, and I think certainly something that you learn, I think, as you deal with in large organizations, or you work with more and more folks.
Michael, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Is there any parting words you want to leave to the audience, or maybe tell people how they can get onboarded with you with Prismatic?
Yeah. So, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation. I, certainly any software company out there that is looking at, how to handle integrations, I'd love to talk with you. It's possible Prismatic's a fit. It's possible it's not, but I think, I have the scars of almost 2 decades now of working in the B2B software world, specifically around, integrations being a big part of it, and would be happy to have conversations with anybody or point you in the right direction. So I'd love to talk, and I appreciate being here.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to Michael Zuercher for joining me on today's podcast. You can learn more about Prismatic at prismatic.io. Show notes for this episode can be found at constantvariables.co. You can get in touch with us by emailing hello@constantvariables.co. I'm at Tim Bornholt on Twitter, and the show is at CV_podcast. Today's episode was produced by Jenny Karkowski and edited by the positive Jordan Doust. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you could take 2 minutes to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, we will give you a mention in a future episode as a thank you. Just visit constantvariables.co/review and we'll link you right there. This episode was brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. If you're looking for a technical team who can help make sense of mobile software development, give us a shout at jmg.mn.